when you're doing a solo dungeon, and this is what ends up happening. And when the royal cities end up looking like this whenever you finally return, you know there's a problem with crowding. Ever since, for obvious reasons, the player base has doubled almost in like the past couple months, and doing solo dungeons has become almost impossible until now. On June 4th, they gave us basically an update that said that dungeons will disappear after people enter them, not after people leave them after the dungeon is complete. And so you no longer have to use actual maps in order to get yourself a dungeon, since it's harder for people to enter the dungeon with you unless they do it almost immediately as you go in. So it's much more convenient now to be able to do your own dungeons, and it's not very difficult to find a dungeon at all. Although you do need to keep in mind that because you aren't using maps, of course the loot won't be as good, but the simple fact of the matter is that now you can actually go out into a yellow zone and find dungeons that haven't already been occupied. It's actually very, very easy to do. It shouldn't take you very long to find yourself a dungeon, and thankfully, we're going to be using this to our advantage in this video. And with that being said, welcome to my Loot from 100 Tier 5 Yellow Solo Dungeons video. This is going to be a pretty short and brief video. We're going to be pushing mostly just for the loot, not really so much for the content. However, if you want some statistics, I do have some. Unfortunately, my computer did crash several times, making me lose a lot of information. However, I do have some, and most of which are basically just the fame I got per hour. I can show you guys my setup, and one of the main things that I want to stress is that it's not so much about how fast I did it, it's not about how fast you do it, it's just the fact that once you do 100 dungeons, this is what you can expect. Note that this is based on RNG and the loot will be different for everybody, but I think 100 is a pretty good sample size, and the loot tab honestly was pretty satisfying. Now, I'm not going to talk about how long it took or anything like that until after we cover the loot, and so honestly, I think we should just go ahead and jump into that right now, and we'll get into the rest of the stuff later. And so without further ado, let's go ahead and start checking out the loot tab. This is from 100 randomly generated solo dungeons in the following zones. One half of it was done here in Tharkle Fissure, and the other half was done in Cairngorm. One of the reasons why I feel like I need to mention that is because for some reason, whenever I was doing dungeons in Cairngorm, I got almost exclusively 1-floor dungeons, and I never saw a 3-floor dungeon. Now, that was for the first, I believe, 30 to 50 dungeons. Now, whenever I started doing them in Tharkle Fissure, I actually ended up getting 2 or 3 separate 3-floor dungeons, and almost all of my dungeons were 2 floors. So I got more fame, but it did probably slow me down. But either way, here is the loot tab. You see that a lot of our items usually peak around tier 6 or tier 6 equivalent. We do have a couple of tier 7s, so we ended up getting a bit lucky with that. But we have a lot of variety and some duplicates. For example, we ended up getting ourselves 3 expert mercenary hoods, some excellent quality items here and there, but one of the things I found most interesting was the capes. We ended up getting a demon cape, a keeper cape, and an undead cape, and these capes are actually pretty valuable. But one of my favorite things to look at with this tab is the silver bags. We actually almost got 1 million silver in bags alone, so that's pretty impressive, I have to admit. So we know that from 100 dungeons, we almost expect roughly 10,000 silver per dungeon in just the bags, which is pretty good. One thing I will note is I did not pick up any of the silver from any of the mobs that I killed. In my opinion, it just wasn't really worth the time. And considering the mobs drop, I believe it's 75-ish silver per kill, it's not super surprising that it would be faster for me to just pass by them, considering each dungeon in silver alone rewards roughly 10k. We ended up getting over a stack of blue runes. We ended up getting 4 Swiftclaw cubs, which is pretty good, 16 tomes, and almost 200,000 fame in tomes of insight. I'm going to scroll through one more time, and if you guys would like to pause the video and check out anything in the loot tab, feel free to do so. Awesome, now on to the next part. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be calculating the fame earned whilst doing these dungeons. If we go ahead and leave the bank, we press the B key, I currently have 1.18 million combat respec fame. And if I were to subtract some of the points, because I did earn some points between these basically happenings, I ended up getting roughly 170,000 from doing arena and some other stuff on the side, which I think would just pretty much bring us pretty close to 1 million. I also ended up getting roughly 200 and I believe it was 19,000 fame respec just because I accidentally had auto respec turned on and I didn't mean to. So we can say that we got 781,000 auto respec fame. Due to math that I did earlier that you don't have to worry about, I ended up getting roughly, if you take this, if I went out and killed a monster right now, I would end up getting roughly 20% of the fame that I received as combat respec, and I actually end up getting a little over 20%. So we end up getting something kind of close to 4.9. So if I were to take this amount of fame that we have here, multiply it by 4.9, we ended up getting close to 4 million fame over the course of these 100 dungeons. Of course, if we divide that by 100, we can see that each dungeon, without using the tomes, is worth approximately, I would say 40,000. But of course, for statistics later on, we can just go ahead and say 38. One thing that I'm going to go ahead and note right there is the fact that I do have premium, so I will be getting 50% more fame than players who do not. So maybe you need to adjust your numbers accordingly if you're going to be trying to do something similar to what I did. And at the rate at which I was doing my dungeons, I would say that I would end up getting 10 times that in fame per hour. So I was roughly pulling close to 382,000 fame per hour. Now, we don't really have to talk about that much more. What we need to do right now is sell the loot. And so let's get on that. And so there you have it. We have about 4 million silver worth of loot, and with the rough estimate of about 38,000 fame per dungeon, we're looking at almost a 1-to-1 silver to fame ratio. Now, I do still have these 200,000 fame worth of beginner tomes of insight, which I will use to make up that difference. And honestly, if it were up to me, I probably would have used the adept tomes of insight for the extra 140,000 fame, but for the sake of the loot tab, I went ahead and sold them anyway. So, as for my build, as you can see over here on the right, I ended up using a Spectre Jacket for the DPS, a Cultist Cowl for the single target melting, and it also allowed me to walk away from mobs if I used this on them, knowing that they were going to die. I used the Soldier Boots for Wanderlust, I used the Bloodletter for the damage and the mobility, and I used the Mist Collar for the sake of lowering my cooldowns, along with a Limhurst Cape to try to keep my mana higher than as high as I possibly can. So this setup may not have been the most optimal, but it's what I wanted to try to get fame with, and I did pretty good. I ended up getting roughly 10 dungeons per hour, 11 dungeons, and sometimes even 12 if I got lucky. Taking about 10 hours to make the video, we ended up making roughly 400k per hour, which is pretty good. And considering we ended up roughly getting about 400k fame per hour, if we were to use the tomes here and the tomes that we had, it may have been just a little bit over 400k per hour, or at least closer to 400k per hour. If this video was useful to you, let me know, and hopefully we'll be seeing another type of loot video soon. Leave your suggestions in the comments, and I'll see you then.